we're very happy to have Dr. Abraham Flanagan and Dr. Aloysius Anici here as speakers today. So Dr. Anici received his PhD in Human Development, Learning and Culture from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. He's an assistant professor of educational psychology at Brandon University, Canada. His research focuses on examining the intersection of culture, engagement, motivation, and regulation of learning, especially among culturally diverse learners. And we also have Dr. Flanagan, who received his PhD in educational psychology from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. He's an assistant professor of educational psychology with Georgia Southern University, Statesboro. Research interests include interplay among mobile technology, digital distraction, self-regulated learning, academic motivation and development, and maintenance of student-instructor rapport. So first we'll have Dr. Abraham Flanagan delivering his presentation on coping with digital distractions in the college classroom. So thank you. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Flanagan.
All right. So I will go ahead and share my screen here. Can you see my screen, Charles? Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, go. Well, then I will go ahead and I will get started. So as Dr. Raphael mentioned, my name is Abe Flanagan. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education here at Georgia Southern University. And I'm here today to talk to you about coping with digital distractions in the college classroom. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start off by just talking about what is digital distraction. So we'll kind of define it, talk about what it looks like, and then we're going to talk about the frequencies, causes, and consequences that are experienced by students when they succumb to digital distraction. And then we'll talk about ways that students can try to overcome digital distraction. So how can we overcome the temptation to check our phone during class? We'll talk about some strategies that you can use. And then as a little bonus round at the end, I'll also talk about simple things that instructors can also try to do that are helpful for curbing student digital distraction as well. All right, so first off, what is digital distraction? And just broadly speaking, digital distraction refers to any time that we use our digital devices during class for off-task purposes. And so examples of off-task activities that we might engage in on our devices during class are things like texting, surfing the internet,
Do you want to go outside?
scrolling through social media, playing games, maybe on our phone, streaming shows, online shopping. So it's kind of recreational activities that are off task and not related to what's going on in the classroom. And some examples of digital devices that are commonly misused during class, things like our mobile phones, particularly smartphones, laptops, tablets, smartwatches, those really popular digital devices that we commonly carry with us throughout our daily lives and that we bring into the classroom as well. And digital distraction can be either a conscious or an unconscious decision. So you might, make the conscious choice of, man, I'm really bored. This instructor keeps droning on and on and on. And so I'm going to scroll through social media because that's more enjoyable than continuing to pay attention. So it might be a deliberate decision. Or maybe you bring your laptop to class to take notes and suddenly you find yourself just clicking over to an Instagram tab, kind of just, instinctively without making the conscious decision. All right, so that's what digital distraction is. It's really just off-task use of digital devices during class for leisure purposes and for off-task purposes. All right, and so before I get going any further, I have a couple of Kahoot questions that I created for all of the students who are here to reflect on their experiences with digital distraction during class. And so I'm going to pull up right now the Kahoot that I created. and it's just 2 questions. And it's probably easiest if you use your mobile phone to enter this Kahoot, so that way you're able to see the screen here, to see the questions, and to respond to them. So on your mobile phone or whatever device you have, just enter the URL and then enter the game pin. Oh, I see that a lot of you are familiar with how Kahoot works already. So I'll give everybody about a minute or so to get in here. All right, so if you're only gonna give about 10 more seconds, and so even if not everybody's able to make it in here, that's fine. We still got a pretty large sample of the audience today to get a feel for our experiences with digital distraction. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get started here. So like I said, even if you're not already in, that's fine. You'll be able to see what the other folks and how they respond. All right, so we've got some digital distraction questions. And like I said, there's just 2 questions here that we're going to go over. And so the first question, this is just a poll question, multiple select, you can select all that apply. Which devices do you most commonly use for off-task purposes during class? Is it your mobile phone, laptop, tablet, smartwatch, or other? All right, yep, and this lines up with some of the research that I'm going to talk about here in a couple of minutes, that the most commonly misused devices during class are mobile phones, particularly smartphones, and laptops, and then tablets and smartwatches, less commonly used, usually just because they're less commonly owned. All right, so we can see that we use a decent variety of devices for off-task purposes during class. And so how much time in the classes where you misuse those devices, how much time do you think that you typically spend? What percentage of that particular class period? All right, so let's see. So we've got only 3% of us say that we never spend any time on our devices for off-task purposes during class. About half are saying around 1 to 10% of the time. And then almost half are saying somewhere between either 11 to 25% or 26 to 50%. And again, the national average across all the studies that I know of related to digital distraction tend to be about 33% of the time for students when we use our devices for off-task purposes during class. We tend to spend somewhere around 25 to 33%. And so right here as a group, we're probably just a little under that average, but still we can see that there's a decent amount of time that we spend using our devices for off-task purposes during class. And so now that we've got an idea of how often we succumb to digital distraction during class, let's just kind of look at some of those national statistics that have been uncovered across multiple studies. So as I mentioned, on average, when we do use our devices for off-task purposes during class, undergrads typically spend about 30% of a typical class period using their devices for off-task purposes. And that's college students have self-reported spending that much time off task and also been observed spending that much time off task as well. Off-task phone usage, for those of us who bring our phones to class and use those, off-task phone usage occurs about once every 5 minutes. And so those of you who are used to texting during class or checking social media, it occurs about once every 5 minutes on average for phone users. And laptop users, and this percentage always surprises me, that laptop users either self-report or have been observed spending about 40 to 50% of class time using their computers for off-task purposes. And I think that percentage is super high, and it's always interesting to me because most of the students who bring laptops with them to class do so because they say that their laptop makes it easier to take notes and then, to learn. But we know that laptop users spend a decent amount of time misusing their computer, and about half of all laptop users also get digitally distracted by their phone during class as well. So we have good intentions for bringing our laptops to class, but for a lot of us, that can result in spending a decent amount of time actually using that class for off-task purposes, which can hinder our learning. And as we're all probably aware and have experienced ourselves, digital distraction occurs pretty consistently throughout the semester, maybe with just a slight dip around midterms as we're gearing up for those tests and maybe getting a little more focused and anxious. And so what contributes to digital distraction? What are the things that undergraduates say cause them to want to pull out their phones and use them or their laptops? And undergraduates have identified quite a few different environmental causes. Things like boredom, that's the most common cause. I'm just bored during class. Either the material's not interesting or it's just taken forever, and so I'm getting bored. Class size, we're more likely to use our devices in classes that have a large enrollment, where maybe we feel a little more anonymous, versus in classes that are smaller and we don't feel as anonymous. Availability of PowerPoints or notes online. So many times instructors will make course materials available online to help students learn, but research has shown that can actually inadvertently lead to digital distraction because students feel like, well, I don't have to pay attention because the PowerPoints and the notes are all available online, so I can just get the material later. And then seeing other students digitally distracted as well. So I see my friend or the person sitting next to me on their phone or scrolling through Instagram on their laptop, so I want to do the same thing. And then we've also found some student characteristics that have been linked to digital distraction tendencies. The first is self-regulation of learning tendencies. So students who take more ownership, who are more purposeful in the learning strategies that they use, who are more reflective in how well their learning is actually going for them. Students who tend to be more self-regulated or more independent tend to succumb to digital distraction less. Academic motivation, the more motivated we are to learn or to pay attention or to master course concepts, the less time we spend digitally distracted. And then also just habitual device use outside of class. The more often we spend using our devices for leisure purposes outside of class, the more likely we are to use those devices for leisure purposes when we're in class as well. So we can see there's a variety of factors that contribute to digital distraction, whether those things are environmental or if they're just characteristics of us as learners. And so what are the downsides of digital distraction for students? We're going to see that there's a whole lot of negative consequences for students, that when we let ourselves get distracted by our devices, it really harms our learning. And we can see here that misusing devices during class can lead to lower quality and quantity of lecture notes. So I've personally done some research where we had students either texting or not texting during an ongoing lecture. And we found that the students who texted recorded fewer notes. The notes that they did record often had incomplete ideas, so it would maybe be half of an idea, or the notes would be missing a lot of important information. So if we're digitally distracted, we're taking fewer and lower quality notes. We perform more poorly on quizzes based on lecture content. And then also, maybe most problematically, the amount of time spent digitally distracted during class is negatively associated with course grades and GPA. So the more time we spend digitally distracted during class, you tend to receive lower course grades and then ultimately have a lower GPA as well. And the reason why digital distraction is so problematic for learning is that it leads to task switching, where our attention shifts back and forth between our device and what we're trying to pay attention to and learn. So we're not really multitasking, we're just shifting back and forth. And sometimes we're paying attention to what's going on in class, and then sometimes we're not. And also, students who misuse their laptops during class, they can distract their classmates and harm their learning as well. Because if you see somebody next to you, streaming a show during class or playing a game, you might find that interesting, and you might start just paying attention to their screen and stop paying attention to what's going on in class. And a digital distraction can also negatively affect instructor perceptions of rapport with their students. And so rapport is kind of that sense of having a healthy, harmonious, friendly relationship with somebody. So if you have a strong sense of rapport with a teacher, it's going to be a teacher who you really like, you enjoy being around, and you feel like they have your best interest in mind. Unfortunately, my own research has shown that instructors, their perceptions of rapport with students can go down if students spend a lot of time using their devices. And so if I have a student in my class and that student's constantly on their devices and not paying attention, maybe I see that as being kind of disrespectful. And so that can maybe harm my sense of rapport with that student. So now we've seen, we know what digital distraction is, how often it occurs, and what the negative consequences of it are for us as learners. So what are some research supported ways that we can try to overcome digital distraction as learners, as students in class? And so I know that it's probably not realistic to ask you to leave your phone at home. We use our phones for all sorts of purposes during the day. Maybe using it for GPS, you're checking your email, your calendar, you're keeping up with people, you're scheduling appointments. And so it's probably not realistic at this point anymore to ask people to leave their smartphones at home. But it's probably not unrealistic to ask that it's turned off and put away during class. Obviously, that's the simplest way that we can go about doing this. But for a lot of people, it might not feel natural. We always have our phone, it's always on, we want to have it on us. And so, it can be difficult sometimes to find that motivation to put the phone away. And so if that's the case, maybe you want to download one of the websites or the social media blocking applications. So I have two right here called Off Time or Freedom. And if you go to their websites, you just Google either of these applications, then you can download them and you can use them to block certain websites or certain social media applications during particular points of the day. So like, when you're supposed to be in class or when you want to be studying in the library. We could also try taking longhand notes. So a lot of students bring their laptop with them to class because they think it helps them take better notes or to learn more. But research doesn't actually support that. Actually, in fact, if the research is slanted one way or the other, it's that longhand note taking. So pencil paper note taking leads to better notes and better learning because we have to be more selective and it's a more deliberate process. And we know that laptop users spend a considerable amount of time distracted. So if you're a laptop user, maybe you want to try taking longhand notes and leaving that laptop at home. So that can separate you from that source of distraction. And you might find that your learning improves by taking longhand notes. And then we can also just try to be more self-regulated learners. So we can do things like decide that I'm going to sit near the front of the room. As you probably wouldn't be surprised to know that most digital distraction occurs in the back half of the room, the further away we are from the instructor. So maybe you make the decision to start sitting near the front of the room. You could incentivize yourself. So if you feel like you're just texting too much in class, or you're scrolling through too much social media and it's harming your learning, maybe you can incentivize yourself and make little promises to yourself that if I don't text during class today, then maybe I'll go get myself a treat at Starbucks, or whatever it might be. Whatever incentive would be motivating for you. If you feel like digital distraction is a problem for you, then try to incentivize yourself to avoid using your devices.
A couple minutes left.
Couple minutes, perfect. And we could also identify, sources of motivation. So, why is it important for you to learn this material? So I know that most, if not all of you, are education majors. And so you could think and reflect on why it would be important for you to learn and master the content in your courses, why you wouldn't want to distract yourself. And so you could try to identify, why are you interested in this material? Why is it important for you? And that could help motivate you to want to pay attention and to learn the material. And then we could also do some self-monitoring. And self-monitoring is where we just kind of, keep track or pay attention to our behaviors and then try to change them. And so one of the last things that I have to show you is a little self-monitoring sheet that I made that I'm going to share with everybody. Whoop, if I can pull it up, I've got so many things on my screen right now. So I created this Google Doc. I'm going to put it into the chat right now. And so everybody in here is able to click on that link that I just put in the chat and open up the self-monitoring worksheet. And the purpose of this worksheet is to help you reflect on, is there a particular class or there are particular classes where you find yourself commonly succumbing to digital distraction. You could identify that class here, and then for a week, keep track of how much time you spend misusing your devices during that class. So if that class meets on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then you can just kind of guesstimate or approximate how much time you spent misusing your devices. And then here, identify why, what factors contributed to it, and then what are 1, 2, or 3 things that you could realistically do to avoid experiencing digital distraction in that class next week. So maybe you could decide you're going to sit near the front, you're going to try to handwrite your notes, whatever it might be. And so you can download this worksheet into a Word doc and print off or copy as many copies as you'd like. And then you can use this as a way to self-monitor and reflect on your digital distraction habits during class. And so with that, I know that I'm about out of time. And so this little resource right here is what I will leave everybody with. And I hope that you found this information helpful and that it'll help you be more reflective on your experiences with digital distraction in your own classes.
Thank you, Dr. Flanagan. And as I should have mentioned before, but I saw at least one question in the chat. I'd like to ask everybody to please hold your questions until after both talks. We'll have a Q&A period at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next presentation. Dr. Aniuchi will talk about designing a classroom context in support of all learners using a culturally responsive self-regulated learning framework. So whenever you're ready, thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this series. As already introduced at the beginning, I'm Dr. Aloysius Aniuchi. I teach here at Brandon University in Canada. And the topic I would love to share with you is designing a classroom context in support of all learners using a culturally responsive self-regulated learning framework. And so this will be the agenda for our conversation. We look at today's multicultural classroom context and explore options about the benefits and possible challenges. And looking at the challenges that we face both as instructors and also students, we look at the way forward, looking at self-regulated learning and cultural responsive teaching as part of the solution to the problems. And then we talk about our cultural responsive self-regulated learning framework and how that can help to support students in our today's multicultural classroom context, and then final thoughts based on the conversations. As we know, when we look around in most classrooms, especially in North America, US and Canada precisely, we notice there are many students from different cultural backgrounds with multiple languages in the class. And these students, they come with so many ideas, their experiences, their perceptions about what learning is all about, their individual goals. And all these things they bring into the classroom, they have influence on how they learn. We can think about the benefits of having multiple students in our classes. My personal experiences and based on research too, we notice that when we chat with people from different cultures, we learn a lot from them because they bring a lot of idea. There is creativity in the classroom because you see things from diverse perspective you maybe not considered before. And when problem-solving situations arise in the classes, there are lots of opportunities to explore different ways, including innovative solutions. And sharing multiple perspectives is always part of the major things we find in multicultural classroom context. These benefits notwithstanding, there are some possible challenges, and I want you to join the slido.com to see what you think that could be possible challenges of either teaching or studying in diverse classroom context. So I would encourage you to join just either in your phone or your laptop using slido.com and the number there. I hope this wouldn't be a digital distraction at the moment. Okay, language barriers. Language, appropriate other cultures, misunderstanding of instructions, combating cultural norms and stereotypes, challenge of unfamiliar content, the not understanding references, so barrier between language, expectations, issues of racism, not acknowledging other cultures, miscommunications, the cultural differences and idioms. Students keep their culture as they learn another culture. Students might not understand what is being presented based on dominant cultural ideas. Issues of custom, beliefs, and language. So there are lots of challenges, as you already mentioned. And as teachers, instructors, and students, these are the things that face us. And when these things happen, there are so many things that they can, create uncomfortable situation for the students. And that is something we need to think about, how best to support our students, bearing in mind these challenges. So by way of summary, most of you mentioned issue of racism, there are social injustice, even systemic racism, intercultural communications, because some students who are not in the dominant culture may not know how best to engage others in communication because of how different the expectations are. Because the environment might be different from where they came from, they find it difficult to negotiate the structures of learning, the expectations. There are gaps between what they know at home and what is being presented in the class. So these are some of the challenges of either teaching or teaching students from different cultural backgrounds. Thinking about these challenges, the question would be, how do we support all learners in a culturally diverse classroom, bearing in mind that today's classroom is populated by students from different cultures? One of the ways we can deal with the problem is self-regulation of learning, by supporting their self-regulation of learning. By way of summary, Self-regulation of learning is a kind of individual and social forms of learning that empowers learners to take control of their thoughts, their actions, their emotions, their engagement, their motivation for a purpose. They take that control in order to achieve a goal. So that means they have to set a goal. They control everything, including digital distractions like Abraham talked about, in order to achieve their goals. And self-regulated learners are proactive. They're also strategic because they try to explore multiple strategies, options in order to achieve their goal. But we know that self-regulation of learning, beyond being a human activity, there are some influences. The whole idea is to look at how learning happens in context, because we know we learn in context. And so that means that individual learner comes into the class with their experiences, their expectations, but what is being presented in the classroom has some external influences. The school's culture, the school program that sometimes are determined by the society or the nation shape what the individual person learned. And we know that in our learning processes, culture plays an important role because we are social beings, we are culturally formed human beings. And so in the context of learning, we see our culture playing parts. Research is showing that self-regulation of learning cuts across different demographic boundaries. That means it's a human event. Everybody regulates. But there are differences in terms of how people define the regulatory processes, how people regulate themselves, the kind of pattern of regulatory processes in terms of individual-oriented or socially oriented practices, and even differences across cultures in terms of motivation and engagement. When we see these variations as a result of cross-cultural research, it tells us about the importance of culture, that culture shapes learning context, and within the learning context has influence in regulatory actions. So for example, as an instructor, my background influences how I design classroom activities. And based on the nature of the classroom activity designed, it can also shape students' regulation of behaviors. And so bearing in mind about the influence of culture on learning, we can also ask a question again, how other ways can we support culturally diverse learners? Then the idea of designing culturally inclusive classroom environment will come to play. And so in as much as we think about supporting student learning through self-regulation of learning, we have to pay attention about the role of culture on regulatory processes. And interestingly, there are research that are already talking about how we can design this kind of environment. So there are culturally inspired pedagogies. There are many of them we can think of: cultural responsive teaching, culturally relevant pedagogy, can also think about culturally sustaining pedagogy. We will not get into details about each of these, but one thing to bear in mind is that they all foreground the influence of culture on learning processes, and then calls on instructors, especially, to consider students' background, their lived experiences, their cultures, their aspirations, while designing classroom activities, because these have impact on how and what students learn. And so thinking about the synergy between self-regulated learning practices and cultural responsive teaching or pedagogical practices, I came up with a theory, or rather a framework, which is what I want to share with you as a solution to the issues of multicultural classroom context. And that is what I call the cultural responsive self-regulated learning framework. This framework has 3 dimensions. One is classroom foundational practices. design instructional practices are the second one, and then dynamic supportive practices. We look at each of these in a small scale manner. So the classroom foundational practices are the practices teachers or instructors put in place in order to understand their students. So who are my students? Where are they coming from? What are their expectations? What are their learning strategies? What are their values and beliefs? This is the moment the instructor or the teacher will try to understand those elements, those factors that influence our learning, and see what the students, each of them, are bringing in the classroom, because they shape not only how they learn, but also how they regulate their learning. And so based on the information gathered from here, it will lead to designing instructional practices. So practices that will pay attention to students' cultures, as well as implementing the practices that support regulation of learning, like choice provision, like assessment practices, and giving students autonomy over what they learn and how. And so to make it culturally responsive means that activities designed in the class, like assignments, will create opportunities to link students' cultural background, the experiences, into such activities. And as students' learning progresses, like a project, for example, the third one will be dynamic supportive practices. And so these are practices that are in place as students' learning unfolds. So you think about having peer assessment, having formative assessment, having the students self-assess themselves. You see element of self-regulated learning here, but at the same time, making it relevant to their culture. So when we think about culturally relevant assessment practices, you might consider having someone from the student's background provide feedback on a work they are embarking on. So like a project that asks the students to work on something that will solve a problem in their community. And then having someone in the community have an input into that learning experience. So that way there's integration of the culture of the students, not only in the activity, but also in the formative assessment process. What this does is that when students' ideas, their cultures, are part of their learning processes, they begin to regulate their learning in a way that is relevant to their culture. When they're given opportunities to write things that are relevant to themselves, they will bring in those aspects, those values in their activities in the class. And by so doing, they're kind of co-regulating the activities in the class, because in a way they're directing the stages or the direction of their learning process. And assuming they find themselves in group activities, you see their ideas shaping the nature of socially shared regulation. And so this framework will not only help instructors to understand students in order to design activities that are relevant to their culture, but also will help students to regulate their learning in a way that is relevant to their culture. And so I present this to you as something to think about, as possible ways we can deal with the problems of today's multicultural classroom context. And thank you for your audience.
Thank you, Dr. Anucci. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So we'll transition to Danny Pizzari, who will carry on from here.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those great talks. I learned quite a bit myself, and I'm looking forward to getting into some more reading later. So we have some time now. If anyone wants to pose any questions to any of our speakers, if you have any questions about digital distractions, cultural responsive, self-regulated learning, now would be a perfect time to solve those curiosities. You can go ahead and use the raised hand function. That might be a good way to do it. Or if you want to use the chat, that's also okay. Giancarlo?
Yeah, hi. I was curious, those statistics that were given about digital distractions, like how often it happens, what age group was that study? Was it high school, college?
All of the studies that I cited were with undergraduate students.
Thank you.
It's very interesting. I'm sure our high school students have plenty of digitally distracting habits as well. Any other questions? Bradley.
Hi, thanks to both of the presenters. I really enjoyed your talks. Dr. Flanagan, I was curious, given that we've experienced this shift towards online teaching, and this requires that we're using these devices that are designed to engage us and distract us. Is there any research on what students' experiences are like in online formats, whether they experience more distraction than in person?
So off the top of my head, I can't think of a study that specifically looked at that, but it could just be that those studies haven't been published yet because they're so new, because that research maybe got spurred during the pandemic. But there is a lot of research that's looked at digital distraction tendencies during homework. So you could think about it like, and these studies didn't focus on that, but if you're watching an asynchronous video lesson as part of homework, the research on digital distraction during homework, which has been focused on like reading assignments or completing worksheets, or just any other kind of traditional homework, and having students either self-report or just observing students while they're completing homework, maybe in like a library or something like that. And it's found that, I'll be unsurprisingly, that students succumb to a whole lot of digital distraction when they're completing homework. There's a study that observed students in the library studying for final exams. And I think it was something like the students went to their phones like 12 or 15 times an hour during the course of studying in the library. And so that kind of work has been done, but I haven't seen any, at least that I'm familiar with, that's looked at online learning activities and digital distraction tendencies. But that's obviously an important gap that needs to be filled. Absolutely.
Any other questions for our speakers? Let's see. I think, is there a hand up?
I have a question.
Oh, yes. Karen.
Yes, so my question has to do with cameras on and cameras off. And if there was any study related to, more digital distraction when the camera is off during these online classes.
That would be such a fascinating research study to see and to carry out. But as I mentioned, there's just so little on digital distractions when students are learning in online courses that I haven't seen anything on that yet. But you're right. That would be certainly, I would expect that there's something to that. Just this sense of accountability of I can see you, so there's a sense of accountability versus if camera's off, I have no idea what you're doing.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's wonderful insight.
Thank you.
These are great questions. They're questions that I was thinking. I didn't even know I was thinking them. I think I saw another hand, a digital hand raised. Jamie?
Thank you. I'm going to lower my hand, but my question is, sometimes when you are, for example, studying, not necessarily in a classroom, but you don't want to study for a long period of time, because then it's not always as effective as it should be. So in those kinds of times, would you consider like the 30 minutes reading, then like not reading as like things that you do digitally as distractions, or do you think of that as like a self-regulated learning that the student has themselves?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you're using it strategically, it sounds like you're talking about something like giving yourself like a brain break.
Yeah.
So maybe I read this section and then, all right, now I feel kind of cognitively taxed. And so I'm going to give myself a brain break and scroll through Facebook or Twitter or whatever for a few minutes. That versus I'm reading and I'm scrolling at the same time, this is going to interfere with your learning more than this, if you use it kind of consecutively as a brain break. Absolutely, I think that those brain breaks are absolutely important. It just kind of matters on how strategic you're being.
Yeah, I understand. It's like, it's a distraction during class if you're not doing anything related, but like you need to take a break from like a long 30-page article and you're like, I can't do this. Like, yeah. All right.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some instructors who give those brain breaks during class, so if it's like a 3-hour class period or something, or even if it's an hour and 15 minutes, when I teach my hour and 15-minute courses, sometimes I'll say, at the 40 or 45-minute mark, let's just take 5 minutes. If people have been working hard, or if there's been a lot, take 5 minutes to kind of, give yourself a brain break. And a lot of that time, people scroll through their phones then too. So,
Thank you.
Great. Giancarlo, you had another question?
Yeah, in terms of the culturally responsive teaching aspect of it, I could see how it would be easy to incorporate that into social studies classes or art classes, even English classes. What might some ways to do that in, let's say, science or math? 'Cause I'm not sure like how easy it would be to connect in those subjects.
Question. I know it's always a challenge in mathematics and sciences, but I think some research are talking about, in mathematics, for example, using their experiences in terms of maybe what problems solving mathematics. So instead of having quadratic equation, to make that equation into words. So saying, for example, if it is a primary school classroom mathematics, that Abraham has 5 phones and he gave 2 to a friend. And the price of each of the phone is $20. How much has he left? So using a phone is a different experience, but thinking about the cultures of those students to integrate those within that parameter might be a way of their recognizing their experiences in the classroom activities that is designed for them. So that might be one way to do that. In sciences, you might also think about a problem in their society, in their culture, depending the topic, and say to them, based on a problem in your country, think of how to use the topic we discussed today to solve that problem. So that way, you are using the classroom context in a way that is relevant to where they're coming from, or to their community, or where they think that is relevant to them. So these are some of the ways I think that could happen. Like in my class, I teach educational psychology class. You might think it is too abstract to do that. One of the things I engage them in is to give them journal reflection activity, where I ask them to choose a topic or a concept we discuss within the week and think through with some questions like, how is this concept conceptualized in your culture? How does this concept help you solve a problem? Or how can you apply this in your life or some other person's life? Or how can you use this concept to advance understanding within your culture? So that way, again, you are helping them to regulate what they're learning by bringing in aspect of their culture within the classroom, even when you as an instructor doesn't know so much about their culture.
I see, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. And on that topic, there's a question in the chat, Aloy. How can we access your culturally responsive framework? Where can we find it?
It is online, actually. The detail of it is, maybe I will post the link. It's still in my dissertation and also one of the short papers I have out there. So probably I'll find the link and post here.
Excellent, excellent. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And Michael had a question as well.
Good afternoon. Sorry my camera's not on. I can't have it on right now. But I want to play devil's advocate here and then ask a question. So we live in a world now of instant gratification. We no longer have to use a map because Waze tells us where to go. We no longer have to figure out how to cook something because we could go on TikTok to go get the recipe, and it's boom, right in our hands. Now, since we've been conditioned this way, I think many people approach education and their schooling this way, where, okay, these slides that you're showing me are on Blackboard. So I'm sitting here and I'm just gonna have to read these slides again, right? So do you feel that people are we've just become bottom line people and we don't care about the process anymore? We just wanna get through this class so we can get this job, so we can pay our bills, and that's that. It just seems like we're in such a different world and different circumstances, and we're expecting the same results, which is kind of silly, don't you think?
Michael, it sounds like you might be interested in, there's research that has looked at the view of education as a consumer commodity and how the view of education as a consumer commodity relates to digital distraction tendencies. And you're probably, based on what you just said, you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that people with a stronger view of education as a consumer commodity. So I'm paying for this, so you just tell me what I need, give it to me. And it's just more of an exchange than anything. That people with that view tend to succumb to digital distraction more, probably because they have the view that, you know, I'm paying for this, and so I can experience it in whatever way makes me most comfortable or most enjoyable. And so I think that mindset kind of speaks to a lot of the points that you just raised, that, yeah, there has been research on that, and it does, that old view of education as a consumer commodity does drive a lot of digital distraction behaviors.
Excellent, very interesting topic. Great. It seems like the questions have settled down, and unfortunately we are reaching the end of our allotted time. So I'd like to thank our speakers. And there's a lot of great links coming into the chat, so make sure you grab those before you leave as well. Excellent.
Thank you for having us. It's really enjoyable. I'm going to post the link to the self-monitoring worksheet that I created for the students. I'm going to put that in there one more time, just so it wasn't buried in the chat for folks.
Thank you. All right. So thank you very much. Is there anything else to add? Any of our speakers need to say anything before we break? Charles?
No, I think we're pretty much there. Yeah. Thank you to all the other professors in the SEYS department and other departments who attended as well, and all the students who attended.